Today we have quite an interesting comparison, the differences between a medieval style crossbow and a modern recurve crossbow. Now, this reproduction medieval crossbow I have on the right is not necessarily the most accurate one, and it's also not intended for actual combat. It's basically like a wall hanging reproduction, but the actual mechanisms are correct, and even if it's slightly small, everything's actually to scale with it. So what I can do is use this to demonstrate the differences between a medieval and a modern crossbow. And one of the problems though is that due to the massive amount of crossbows that were in the Middle Ages going up into sort of the Renaissance period, as they eventually replaced with gunpowder weapons, there's so many variations of crossbow designs and so much contrasting evidence online when I've tried looking them up, or if you look them up in books, that it's pretty much impossible to find out exactly what the draw weights would have been, what, a lot of things like that, what the bow span would have been. But in general, one thing I've certainly come to the conclusion of is, over time, before crossbows were eventually completely replaced by muskets, the draw weights were getting heavier, the bow spans were typically getting wider, and the draw length and the bolts used were longer. But for the most common medieval crossbow, this is basically what you've got. It's hand spun, which means you pull it back with your hand. Slightly bigger models have had a stirrup. And the most important thing to notice is typically it has a tiny draw length. The bolts are not very long at all, so once you cocked it and put the bolt in, the bolt would only be a few inches long. If you think what a pistol crossbow's bolt would be, they weren't much bigger than that. They were a lot thicker, but they weren't size-wise much bigger than a pistol crossbow bolt. Certainly nothing like a modern recurve crossbow is. So what I thought I'd do is go into some of the features and show you why a modern crossbow is so much better than the medieval one in terms of what you actually get out of it power-wise. So here we have our medieval crossbow. As said, this is one that's not intended for combat, it's intended to be a wall hanger. So it's a reproduction that's built to visually look just about right. I think these bits here are actually just for wall hanging it if you took the prod off, so ignore those. They're not sights or anything. So on a medieval crossbow you've got the stock, which I believe was called a tulla, and that's quite a nice carved wooden one on this, but the stock's purpose wasn't actually normally to go into your shoulder, it was to be used on the cheek weld, so I'll demonstrate that in a moment. And you've got what was called the tickler, which today we'd call the trigger, which you'd push that in and this would rotate that backwards to shoot the bow. Typically you'd have a hemp string or something like that on a medieval crossbow. This is a hemp string on this one. And the string is another thing, it's far more energy inefficient, a hemp string, than the modern synthetic strings are, meaning you lose energy. And that's really the main problem with medieval crossbows is, despite some of them going up to crazily stupid draw weights, I think there's been ones measured over 1,000 pounds of draw, the issue was that you had very little energy efficiency, so it was diminishing returns. You might have all that energy going in to cock it, but a lot of that energy was wasted in the frame of the crossbow, and the bolt would probably, leave without much velocity. And to give you an example, a modern compound crossbow that's about 200 pounds of draw weight would be more powerful than anything that existed in the medieval period. Simply because even the massive siege bows weren't that great, they couldn't penetrate plate mail. That's sort of a myth that gets repeated a lot. So, you'd have this onto your cheek, you'd aim down the crossbow like that with the bolt inserted, then you'd loose it by simply pulling this up. And that releases the string and the crossbow shoots. But as we said, very small draw weight. If you were to have that cocked, you'll see that's not very long at all. You see the size of my hand, that's it. Now what I'm going to do is just get some bolts to demonstrate, and here's our bolts. So this would take one of these, That's a medieval crossbow bolt, a reproduction of one. It might not be the most accurate reproduction, because this has flights on it, and as far as I'm aware, medieval crossbows did not have flights on. They had wooden flights, not with a feather. But as you can see, it's not massively long. Now, comparison wise, let's look at the length of this, and you'll see it's a lot longer, a modern bolt. And having a modern bolt which is that length, more like an arrow than a bolt, pretty much demonstrates, you know, how much more energy efficient it is. That's another thing of this crossbow, is that the this falls out for some reason every time you shoot it. I don't know why. Just fits straight back in, but it's a bit odd. It comes out, but the mechanism does work. It, you know, if it didn't fly out, the mechanism would work fine. So I don't know why it does that, but as I said, that doesn't annoy me, because I bought this more as a decorative piece and to illustrate points than, you know, use it as a functioning crossbow. You can buy reproduction functioning medieval crossbows, but they're a bit out of my budget. They're normally £300 or more, and as stated, due to be owing energy inefficient, if you're buying, you know, a crossbow that's £150 draw weight on a medieval bow, you're getting probably only the energy of a £50–60 prod on a modern recurve. It's pretty awful. Not to say the craftsmanship's bad, it's just simply that they're very bad energy inefficient designs. So, as I was saying, a lot of that comes from a shorter bow span, normally made out of steel, where on a modern crossbow it's compressed fiberglass and it's a recurve and it's a longer bow span. So once you have a shorter draw weight, you can't have as much energy being transferred to a bolt. You have a shorter bow span, again less energy, and the materials making the string and the bow weren't as good. When you have a shorter bolt, it's less efficient at long range than a long bolt would be, or arrow, just because of the design. So now we've looked at this, what I'm going to do is get the other crossbow out and we'll look at the features that make a modern crossbow so much better than the medieval one. Now you'll hopefully notice size-wise this thing's pretty big, you know, difference. The length of it is a lot bigger. You've got a proper rifle stock on there, so with a cheek weld, so you can put that into your shoulder more efficiently and aim down the sights. And we've got actual sights, you're not just aiming along the bow. We've got an iron sight on here and a front sight, open sights, but you could, you know, if you wanted to, with the rail, fit a scope. But let's look at it. So the draw is to there. Once you get to this point, this is where the string locks in. So you've got basically about a 13-inch power stroke, you know, draw length on the bow. And as said, look how much bigger that bow is, and it's compressed fiberglass. And we've got the synthetic string. So these factors make this a much better bow, because the longer bow span combined with a longer draw, better materials for both the bow and string, mean that you've just got simply more energy that's going to be transferred onto the bolt, and it's a more efficient bolt because it's more like an arrow. You know, it's a heavier projectile that's longer, better stabilised. Medieval crossbow, from accurate accounts I can find, seem to be probably about 50 yards maximum range. For normal infantry crossbows, they're anything from about, you know, £100 draw weight, something like £300–400 draw weight, often assisted with cocking mechanisms. And obviously you did have the stupidly powerful windlass type bows or siege bows, but again, they'd have had longer range and the bolts would have been getting longer at this point, but they still wouldn't be really anything as good as this. If a medieval crossbowman had access to a crossbow like this, they'd have easily been, you know, not replaced by muskets for a much longer period, just because these things are so much more energy efficient, and you could probably beat longbowmen with these. Obviously, although this range on it would be shorter than a longbow, it has a lot more advantages, whereas a medieval crossbow's only real advantage was it was easier to train people how to use it, and you could use it in more confined spaces. I'll show you now what it looks like when you're sort of wielding them with the cheek weld, and I'll show you sort of how that's different as well with the sights. Okay, so we're going to look at the sort of mechanism on each of the bows. So on a medieval crossbow, once you had it pulled back, you would basically cheek weld like this. You're not actually putting it into your shoulder like that, although you could do. What they'd normally do is hold it like that and look along the bow. then obviously you just lift that up to shoot it when you want to shoot. So in terms of aiming, even though it didn't have a full stock, aiming like that is pretty efficient. You know, if I'm shooting somebody at not massively long range, you can get a pretty good sight impression by doing that. But it's still not as good as a normal bow, because there's no adjustable sights, and as we said, this would probably only be accurate to about 50 yards, or useful at that range, just because a bolt over longer range wouldn't work very well. It's still a projectile weapon, so it's relying on physics, so if you were shooting it slightly upwards it would come down, but compared to a normal arrow it's still not going to be as good coming down, because there's less weight behind it and less, you know, stabilisation. But as I said, this isn't very big at all. There were obviously bigger medieval crossbows than this. This might be a bit smaller because it's sort of a wall hanging decoration, but the principles are the same. If you scale this up a bit bigger it would still have a far shorter draw, because medieval bows typically had very short bolts or quarrels. So, here we have a modern crossbow. So I can put it into my shoulder like that using the stock, cheek weld here, and then use the iron sight to get a really accurate idea of where the bolt's going to go. We also have a modern trigger on a modern crossbow. I don't mind medieval crossbow because you can very slowly squeeze it up. This is a lot safer because we have a safety on this as well. The medieval crossbow does not have a safety, but assuming that you didn't have the safety on one of these, the trigger is still a lot harder to knock because you've got a trigger guard. So if you have good trigger discipline, it's hard to knock it. Whereas a medieval crossbow, your only real safety is if you insert your hand between the tickler and, you know, the body of the crossbow. So you've got an actual trigger, so you can just squeeze the trigger to release. I quite like the tickler, to be honest, on the medieval crossbow. It does work well for shooting an arrow. You've got a proper hand grip on this as well, so you've got a you know, better place to keep your hand out of the way of the rail. As we said, look how much difference there is in the length of this thing, and the power as well. If I was to shoot this, I mean, I've got lots of videos on my channel, as I'm sure you're aware, of me shooting these crossbows. You'll know that one of these crossbows, especially the more higher draw weight ones, are stupidly powerful. And I still find it crazy to think that a lot of medieval crossbows, as far as we know, are probably less powerful than my £40 recurve crossbow that I've put together. But a £150 modern recurve, even, you know, one of the low end ones like this, is still far more energy efficient than a medieval crossbow could have hoped to have been. And the giant siege medieval crossbows, not talking about ballistas, you know, like siege equipment, but the actual, you know, where you'd have it on the floor and you'd have your sort of windlass or whatever type of crank, you know, either doing that or doing this, they would still be nowhere near as powerful, just because the fact that the energy inefficiencies and the bolts are typically shorter, so lots of factors weighed up to mean they wouldn't, you know, be all that efficient. They'd still, you know, kill people in medium to soft, like light armour, soft targets, but there are people who've, you know, built the really expensive to do reproduction medieval crossbows authentically, shot them at plate armour. They get sparks and things, you know, those bolts are travelling really fast over a short distance, but they put massive dents in that can't puncture the armour. Where I'm sure a modern compound, you know, especially something like a Scorpid, the really high-end crossbows, if you shot a plate arm of that and a really good head on it, like a bodkin type head, it would go through. Or, you know, it's the closest you'll get to going through, whereas the medieval siege crossbows, despite their massive draw weight, aren't great in comparison just because of diminishing returns of energy loss. Anyway, that's rattling on a bit, but that's why a medieval crossbow, like this one, is less energy efficient than a crossbow like this, simply because a medieval crossbow's components mean it can't be as energy efficient, and on a medieval battlefield something like a longbow is far better than a crossbow. Right, thanks for watching, subscribe for more.